My father's caregiver, Carmen, had been providing excellent care for 2 years. She was kind, patient, and my father trusted her completely. After his death, I discovered she had been slowly poisoning him and had manipulated him into changing. His will to leave her half of his inheritance. My name is Robert Martinez. I'm 52 years old, and I'd just discovered that the healthcare professional I'd trusted with my father's life had actually been systematically murdering him while appearing to provide compassionate elder care. But what I learned about Carmen Rodriguez's predatory operation would prove that my father's death was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been targeting vulnerable elderly patients for years, standing in the attorney's office, listening to my father's will being read and hearing that Carmen Rodriguez was to receive $300,000 and half ownership of his house. I felt like I was experiencing a complete break from reality. According to this document, the woman I'd paid to care for my father had somehow convinced him to leave her a fortune. But according to everything I'd observed about my father's relationship with Carmen, she was a professional caregiver who had maintained appropriate boundaries while providing excellent medical care and emotional support during his final years. The man whose will was being read had died peacefully in his sleep after what appeared to be a gradual decline due to age and chronic health conditions. But the will suggested that Carmen had developed a relationship with him that went far beyond professional caregiving. To understand how Carmen had been able to position herself to inherit my father's wealth while simultaneously ending his life. I need to explain how our family had come to trust her and why we'd never suspected that his caregiver was actually his murderer. My father, Eduardo Martinez, was 78 years old when we'd first hired Carmen Rodriguez through Eldercare Solutions, a highly rated home healthcare agency that specialized in providing in-home care for elderly patients with chronic medical conditions. Dad had been diagnosed with diabetes and early-stage dementia 2 years earlier, and his condition had progressed to the point where he could no longer safely live alone. But he'd been adamant about not wanting to move to a nursing home or assisted living facility. I want to stay in my own house, he told me during one of our conversations about his care options. This is where your mother and I built our life together. I don't want to spend my final years in some institutional setting. After researching various home care options, we decided that hiring a live-in caregiver was the best solution for Dad's medical needs and his desire to remain in familiar surroundings. Carmen had come with excellent references from Eldercare Solutions. She was 45 years old, had 8 years of experience in elder care, and specialized in caring for patients with dementia and diabetes. Your father will receive 24-hour care and companionship, Carmen had explained during our initial meeting. I understand the challenges of caring for someone with cognitive decline, and I'm committed to maintaining his dignity and comfort. Carmen had seemed genuinely caring and professional during our interviews. She'd asked thoughtful questions about Dad's medical history, his daily routines, and his personal preferences. I want to understand who your father is as a person, she'd said. Good care isn't just about managing medical conditions. It's about preserving someone's sense of self and helping them maintain the highest possible quality of life. The arrangement we'd established had been comprehensive and well-structured. Carmen would live in Dad's guest room, prepare his meals, manage his medications, and provide companionship and assistance with daily activities. I'll maintain detailed records of his medical condition and communicate regularly with his doctors, Carmen had assured me. You'll receive weekly updates about his health and any concerns that arise. The monthly cost had been substantial, $8,000 for full-time live-in care, but it had seemed like a reasonable investment in Dad's comfort and safety during his final years. Carmen's care during the first few months had exceeded our expectations. Dad had seemed happier and more stable than he'd been since Mom's death 3 years earlier. Carmen is wonderful, he told me during one of my weekly visits. She makes excellent meals, helps me remember my medications, and we have such nice conversations. What do you talk about? Everything. My work, my time with your mother, stories about when you were young. She's a very good listener. Carmen had maintained professional boundaries while clearly developing a warm relationship with Dad. She'd been respectful during family visits, had provided detailed updates about his condition, and had seemed genuinely invested in his well-being. Your father is such a sweet man, she'd tell me after our weekly check-ins. He has so many interesting stories, and despite his memory issues, he still has such a good heart. The medical management that Carmen had provided had been particularly impressive. Dad's diabetes had been well controlled. He'd been taking his medications consistently, and his overall health had seemed stable despite the progressive nature of his dementia. Carmen really understands his medical needs. Dr. Patricia Chun, Dad's geriatrician, had observed during one of his appointments. His blood sugar levels have been much more stable since she started caring for him. But looking back, I realize that Dad's stable condition under Carmen's care had actually been a carefully managed decline that had been designed to appear natural while systematically weakening his health. A first concerning change I'd noticed had been Dad's increasing confusion and disorientation during my visits. He seems more confused lately. I'd mentioned to Carmen after a particularly difficult visit where Dad had barely recognized me. Dementia progression is unpredictable, she'd explained. Some days are better than others, but the overall trajectory is unfortunately downward. Should we be adjusting his medications or consulting with his doctor? I've been in touch with Dr. Chun about his cognitive changes. She agrees that this is consistent with normal disease progression. The second concerning change had been Dad's physical deterioration. He'd been losing weight, complaining of frequent stomach problems, and seemed increasingly frail. I'm worried about how thin he's getting, I'd said during one of our conversations. Appetite loss is common with dementia, Carmen had explained. I've been trying different foods to encourage him to eat, but it's challenging. Maybe we should consider nutritional supplements or consult with a dietitian. That's a good idea. I'll talk to Dr. Chun about nutritional support options. But the consultations with specialists and the nutritional interventions that Carmen had supposedly arranged had never materialized, and Dad's condition had continued to decline. The third concerning change had been Dad's increasing social isolation. He'd stopped wanting to see friends or participate in activities he'd previously enjoyed. Dad seemed so withdrawn lately, I'd observed after a visit where he'd barely engaged in conversation. Depression is common with dementia patients, Carmen had said. The cognitive changes can be very frustrating and discouraging. Should we consider antidepressant medication or counseling? I've discussed this with Dr. Chun. She feels that adding more medications might cause more problems than it solves. Each of Dad's declining symptoms had been explained by Carmen in ways that seemed medically reasonable and consistent with his diagnosed conditions. But the overall pattern had been a systematic deterioration that had occurred under the care of someone who was supposedly providing excellent medical management. Dad's death had occurred on a Tuesday morning in March, when Carmen had found him unresponsive in his bed and had called emergency services. I checked on him at 7 a.m. like I always do, she told the paramedics. He was breathing normally when I brought him his morning medications, but when I returned an hour later, he had passed peacefully in his sleep. The death had been attributed to complications from diabetes and dementia, which seemed consistent with his declining health over the previous months. The attending physician had signed the death certificate without ordering an autopsy, noting that Dad's death was consistent with his medical history and expected disease progression. Carmen had been devastated by Dad's death, crying at the funeral and expressing genuine grief about losing someone she'd cared for so closely. "He was like family to me," she'd said during the reception after the funeral. "I'm going to miss him terribly." The reading of Dad's will 2 weeks after his death had been the first indication that something was seriously wrong with the circumstances of his death and Carmen's role in our family's life. Mr. Martinez has left specific bequests to his caregiver, Carmen Rodriguez, the attorney had announced, the sum of $300,000 from his savings account and a 50% ownership interest in his residential property. 50%? I'd asked, certain there had been some mistake. According to this will, which was updated 6 months ago, Ms. Rodriguez is to receive half ownership of the house and a substantial cash inheritance. My father had dementia. How could he make major changes to his will? The will was witnessed and notarized properly. Mr. Martinez appeared to understand the nature of the document when he signed it. The attorney had shown me the updated will, which had been completely rewritten to benefit Carmen while reducing my inheritance from the family home and most of Dad's savings. "This doesn't make sense," I'd said, examining the document. My father barely remembered my name toward the end. How could he have made these kinds of complex financial decisions? The witnesses certified that he was competent to make these changes. Carmen Rodriguez apparently meant a great deal to him. The investigation I'd begun that day revealed the scope of Carmen's predatory operation and the systematic methods she'd used to murder my father while positioning herself to inherit his wealth, working with a private investigator named Detective Lisa Thompson, who specialized in elder abuse cases. I discovered that Carmen Rodriguez had been targeting wealthy elderly patients for over 6 years. Carmen's pattern is consistent across multiple victims, Detective Thompson explained during our first meeting. She targets elderly patients with substantial assets, gains employment as their caregiver, then systematically poisons them while manipulating them to change their wills. How many other victims are we talking about? We've identified at least 8 elderly patients who died under Carmen's care over the past 6 years. The total value of inheritances she's received is over $2.4 million. How has she avoided detection for so long? Because her victims die of what appears to be natural causes, and their families don't suspect that their trusted caregiver is actually their murderer. Detective Thompson's investigation revealed Carmen's sophisticated methods for slowly poisoning elderly patients while avoiding suspicion from families or medical professionals. She uses small doses of various toxins that mimic the symptoms of existing medical conditions, Thompson explained. Arsenic causes symptoms that look like diabetes. Complications. Mercury poisoning mimics dementia progression. How does she avoid detection in medical tests? She's very knowledgeable about which toxins show up in routine blood work and which ones don't. She also times the poisoning to coincide with expected disease progression. The forensic analysis that Detective Thompson had arranged revealed elevated levels of arsenic and mercury in Dad's hair and nail samples, indicating systematic poisoning over several months. Your father was being slowly killed while everyone believed he was receiving excellent medical care, Thompson said. Carmen's knowledge of pharmacology and her access to his medications made her the perfect predator. But the most disturbing aspect of Carmen's operation wasn't just the murders. It was the psychological manipulation she'd used to convince vulnerable elderly patients to change their wills. Carmen isolates her victims from their families and convinces them that she's the only person who truly cares about them, Thompson explained. She creates a dependency relationship that makes elderly patients willing to leave her their money. How does she convince them to change their wills? She tells them that their families don't visit enough, don't appreciate them, and are just waiting for them to die. She positions herself as the only person who provides genuine love and care. The recordings that Detective Thompson had recovered from Carmen's phone revealed conversations where she'd systematically manipulated Dad's perception of our family relationship. "Your son only visits once a week," she'd told him during one recorded conversation. "If he really cared about you, he'd spend more time here. He has his own life and responsibilities. But you're his father. You should be his priority. I'm here every day because I care about you. I know you do, Carmen. You're very good to me. I'll always take care of you, Eduardo. I'm the only one who really understands what you need." The manipulation had been systematic and cruel, designed to convince Dad that Carmen was more devoted to him than his own family, while she was actually poisoning him to death. The legal proceedings against Carmen were complex because proving intentional. Poisoning in elderly patients with existing medical conditions required extensive forensic analysis and expert testimony. Elder abuse cases involving poisoning are difficult to prosecute, explained Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. But the evidence against Carmen is overwhelming once you see the pattern across multiple victims. What evidence do we have? Toxicology results showing systematic poisoning, financial records showing inheritance manipulation, recordings of psychological manipulation, and testimony from multiple families who lost elderly relatives under similar circumstances. Carmen was ultimately charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of elder abuse, and numerous fraud charges related to inheritance theft. The trial revealed the scope of Carmen's predatory enterprise and the sophisticated methods she'd used to target vulnerable elderly patients. Rodriguez specifically sought employment with wealthy elderly patients who lived alone and had limited family oversight. Prosecutor Walsh explained during her opening statement. She used her medical knowledge to slowly poison her victims while manipulating them psychologically to change their wills in her favor. The evidence presented during the trial showed that Carmen had received over $2.4 million in inheritances from 8 elderly patients who had died under her care. Each victim followed the same pattern, Prosecutor Walsh continued. Rodriguez would provide excellent care initially, gain the victim's trust, isolate them from their families, begin systematic poisoning, manipulate them to change their wills, then accelerate the poisoning until they died. Carmen was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution to the families of her victims. But for the families of Carmen's victims, the criminal conviction provided limited comfort. The psychological trauma of knowing that someone they'd trusted to provide care had actually been murdering their loved ones was devastating and long-lasting. The worst part isn't the money she stole, I reflected during a victim impact statement. It's knowing that my father's final months were spent being slowly poisoned by someone he trusted completely. The experience fundamentally changed how I think about elder care and the vulnerability of elderly people to predators who exploit their trust and dependence. Carmen succeeded because elderly people are inherently vulnerable to manipulation by caregivers, explained Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a geriatrician who testified as an expert witness during the trial. When someone is dependent on another person for basic needs, they become emotionally attached and susceptible to exploitation. The case led to increased oversight of home health care agencies and mandatory background checks for elder care workers. But the fundamental vulnerability of elderly patients to caregiver abuse remains a serious concern. The most important protection for elderly people is family involvement and oversight, Dr. Rodriguez advised. Regular visits, medical appointment attendance, and financial monitoring can help detect abuse before it becomes fatal. 3 years after Carmen's conviction, I've learned to focus on the fact that Dad did receive excellent care during the early months of Carmen's employment, and that his final years included many moments of comfort and companionship, even though they were manipulated by someone with evil intentions. Carmen stole his final months and his money, but she couldn't steal the person he was or the love we shared. I reflected during a support group meeting for families affected by elder abuse the caregiver who had promised to protect my father's health and dignity had actually been systematically destroying both, while positioning herself to profit from his death. Sometimes the people who appear most dedicated to caring for our loved ones are actually the ones planning to harm them for personal gain. And sometimes the most important protection we can provide for vulnerable family members is our own vigilant involvement in their care, regardless of how competent and trustworthy their professional caregivers appear to be. Carmen Rodriguez had built her entire career on exploiting the trust that families place in healthcare providers, and had used that trust to commit systematic murder while appearing to provide compassionate care. The perfect caregiver who had seemed so devoted to my father's well-being had actually been devoted to stealing his life and his money while maintaining the performance of someone who cared deeply about his welfare.